What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Transitions to Democracy. I hope that you had a wonderful weekend and that you're feeling rested and ready to get back into it. As always, I'm very happy to see you and that you're here with us tonight. We have a great opportunity to connect what we've been discussing in class to real events, and in particular, real events that have the potential to really be consequential. And what I'm talking about is the vote to draft a new constitution in Chile. Many of you maybe know that yesterday Chileans voted on whether they want to draft a new constitution to replace the 1980 constitution, which was drafted by the Pinochet military government and approved in a fraudulent plebiscite, and whether they want a constituent assembly composed of 50% women and 50% men to draft that constitution, or the Congress to draft that constitution. And Chileans voted in overwhelming numbers to draft a new constitution and replace the dictatorship era 1980 constitution. They also voted overwhelmingly to create a constituent assembly composed of 50% women and 50% men. That is, they voted not to enable Congress to write the Constitution and instead to give that power to the Assembly. Now, this can be viewed as a democratization reform because the Constitution is a component of that authoritarian era in that authoritarian regime. The Constitution was one way that the regime sought to institutionalize its influence and create obstacles to reform under the future democratic government. It was one way that they sought to cement their privileges, putting in place all sorts of supermajority requirements that would block reforms, human rights amnesties, protecting officers for crimes committed against humanity during the dictatorship, all sorts of rules regarding restrictions on the participation of the state in the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This document is a part of the authoritarian era, and a full 40 years later, it is now set to be amended and to be replaced in its entirety. Now, what's happening in Chile is really, really interesting and really important, but I want to go further, and I want to highlight the critical role of popular protest. Now, we've been talking about the role of mass mobilization in democratization. We've been talking about how masses become vitally important, especially when it comes to enlarging the support of the opposition, exposing the abuses of the authoritarian regime, garnering third-party support in the form of sanctions and international support, etc. We know that popular protest was critical in Eastern Europe in facilitating democratization. We know that it was important in South Africa. It was important in Nepal. It's been important in a lot of places. And it was important in Chile as well. And in fact, this process leading up to this vote on whether or not to draft a new constitution was essentially jump-started by a massive popular protest, a massive popular uprising that began in October 2019. Now, back then, in 2019, the Transportation Commission in Chile increased the price of the subway fare. And this inspired a mass uprising, opposition to the change, but more generally, opposition to the legacy of the dictatorship, and in particular, the 1980 Constitution. Because you see, the 1980 Constitution, as a document, as a set of policies, created a very, very, very aggressive free market model that reduced the role of the state to virtually nothing. And it meant that Chileans have been strapped with very, very high prices for things like privatized utilities. It meant that they have to pay a great deal just to take the interstate or use a bathroom in public. And it meant that they have to pay for most things with credit cards. In general, it's a model that is abusive and permits arbitrary expressions of power by economic and political elites. And above all, voters and protesters in Chile feel like the model and the government are not responsive to the wants and the needs of ordinary people, and in particular, the middle class. And one legacy of this constitution and this free market model has been extreme inequality. There's a very, very tiny plutocratic elite who control much of the economy in Chile. There's a moderate middle class and there's a large lower class. And the people in Chile are thoroughly dissatisfied with these legacies, thoroughly dissatisfied with their conditions, and they've been demanding since October 2019 a new constitution. And on one particular day in November, 1.5 million people, a quarter of the population of Santiago, assembled peacefully. This is them in Plaza Italia, which is the central square. Fun fact, I lived 4 blocks away from Plaza Italia when I lived in downtown Santiago while I worked and studied there for 4 months. But this is where people gather, and this is where most organizing takes place. Millions more protested nationwide, and it became a collective effort. And solidarity was not in short supply during this time. These mass protests underscoring the dissatisfaction with the Constitution, the responsiveness of the government, and the inequality in the conditions that people live in as a result of the Constitution. Now, I want to show you a video of one of the popular protests, and I'm going to pause the recording so that YouTube doesn't block my video on copyright grounds. This is so inspiring to me, you have no idea. It's personal for me because I've written and published my own research on Chile as a case that I study along with others. And I've focused on the reform of economic and political institutions in that country. And so I know what they're up against, and I know what they're fighting to overturn and transform. And so when I see these enormous crowds, these enormous protests, this huge rebellion, it's inspiring because it's given way to a new course for the country. And that begins with the writing of a new constitution. And that constitution will very likely embody their demand for a new egalitarian social pact, one that overcomes the dominance of the free market model and enfranchises citizens socially and economically and politically, and provides them with the support that they need to exercise basic civil and political rights. A common saying that you heard on the streets and you still hear was, neoliberalism was born in Chile and will die in Chile. And what they mean is that the 1980 Constitution was the vehicle for the imposition of neoliberalism in Chile under military rule, and it now ends. And this is exciting because it shows us yet again that social uprisings and protests and rebellions, when done peacefully, can be very effective means. Let me tell you, writing a new constitution was not on anyone's agenda. No one thought that that was possible. No one thought there was a political party that could do it or a leader who could mobilize the support necessary to do it. But millions of Chileans getting out into the streets in rebelling peacefully, in demonstrating their power and their capacity to bring everything to a stop was what finally did it. And so this should not be misunderstood as a small thing. This is an extraordinary event, and it highlights the role of popular protest in the ways that we discussed it as being instrumental in bringing about change that otherwise would not be brought about. And so I want you to be inspired by what we see in Chile, and I want you to think about what lessons it has for the world regarding the role of popular protest and rebellion and uprising and so on and so forth. And before we continue, I just want to know what you think we can learn from Chile. You know, what's the takeaway here for the United States, for other countries, for us in this class? Does this reinforce our belief in the potential for massive change? Does it make us believe that ordinary people, through protest and direct action, can bring about these changes? Does it inspire us? What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the key tenets of this particular action, which is demonstrating how peaceful demonstrations are still effective in uniting people under a common cause and still leading to successes at the bureaucratic level.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. You know, one of the biggest criticisms of Chile's party system in its democracy is that democratic institutions in that country have become unresponsive to ordinary citizens. And in particular, political parties and elites and legislators tend to represent well organized interests like unions and employers and owners of capital and big organized interests who have a lot of influence and a lot of clout. Now, this is obviously problematic for a democracy because representation and responsiveness are important. But look at what we're seeing here. This is responsiveness. This is the way it went down in Chile. In October and November 2019, at the height of the protests, the presiding Piñera administration faced competing calls to either step down or call out the military to the streets to suppress the protesters and ensure order. In a plot twist, Piñera came out and said, instead, I'm initiating the process of writing a new constitution. That was a decision that Piñera made in response to the demands of the protesters who didn't want the military in the streets and didn't necessarily want his government to only step down. They did, but what they wanted more was for a new constitution to be written. And so this is an example of how people power, as we called it in the case of Nepal, becomes instrumental in bringing about democratization reforms or setting about processes that otherwise would not have happened. And that's an example of what Ishan's pointing out, the capacity of ordinary people to rise above the limits of democratic institutions and the weaknesses of those institutions, even in the best case, the case of Chile, which we know is a strong democracy, but one that still struggles with a lot of legacies. Arturo says, I am excited seeing that Bolivia and now Chile are making new moves towards their democracy. Me too. And one thing that excites me the most is that the new constitution, the assembly, the constitutional assembly, will consist of 50% women and 50% men. That's important because that is the first step towards egalitarianism. That's a radical restructuring of decision making in Chile, and it's one that can ensure, hopefully, that the feminist movement in Chile is well taken care of by the new constitution. And I know from experience, it's one of the best organized movements in the world. They often lead marches. The feminist movement is extremely well coordinated and very articulate. They're so effective that they have routinely taken control of universities and headquarters of universities, and entered into negotiations with the government in order to be persuaded to leave. This is how effective they are uh, in what they seek to do. And this is one more example of that, pressuring successfully to ensure that the composition of the assembly, the constitutional assembly, is 50% men, 50% women. Yoel says it's a big victory. Make no mistake. I remember hearing about the protests a year ago, and in such a little time, their mobilization made it happen. This also demonstrates how voting matters everywhere, and not just on our home front. Chile offers proof of that, as well as Bolivia most recently, whether it's electing a political party back into office after being ousted or demanding to rewrite a constitution that speaks to a working class. Absolutely. And what this also shows, to complement Yoel's point, is that peaceful protest and voting are not mutually exclusive. We do both. In fact, usually we bring about those elections that are referendums on constitutions or governments through popular protest. In Chile, this election was brought about through popular protest. If not for those protests, Chileans would not have gone to the polls to vote on a new constitution. But without voting on that new constitution, their protests also wouldn't have come to anything. So both protesting and voting matters. And it matters in a very material way, in the sense that they literally were able to secure the convening of a constituent assembly that will be able to write a constitution in direct response to the needs of the working class and others in Chile. And so, very exciting, very, very exciting. I personally am watching to find out how the economy will change and what kinds of economic policies will come out of the rewriting of the Constitution. I think that there will be an expanded role for the state in providing social services and healthcare, in providing education. I think that there may even be some industries that come under the control of the state. Um, I also think that there will be some governance reforms in state enterprises that do remain state enterprises, and that will involve reductions in the power of the military in the defense industry in particular. So there's a lot here, and there's so much to be excited about. Martin says, it is incredibly inspiring, especially viewing this from the US, both in liberal and conservative perspectives. It always feels as if the law moves too slow at times, especially in politically polarized times, though it is tragic to see that it takes things to get so bad to convince masses of people to vote for such a dramatic shift. So it is inspiring, Martin, and remember that I think that the thing to remember is they were never given a chance to vote before 2020 on whether they wanted a new constitution. This is the first time they were given that question. But I think what you would find is that going back many decades, probably as early as the mid 90s, people would have voted for a new constitution if given the choice. I think what had to happen is the popular protest that eventually gave way to that election by forcing the hand of Piñera, who said, I will hold an election. We will hold an election to decide whether we will write a new constitution. So I think that your point is a very good one. We should take solace in the fact that voters seem to have had that preference for some time, but that they were finally able to come together collectively in a forceful way and secure that election that they always hoped for. Could these new cases maybe inspire other Latin American countries to take suit? Arturo, absolutely. So where are there opposition movements who are seeking either democratization or democratization reforms? Well, Venezuela is one example. We can also think of cases like Nicaragua and Guatemala, where authoritarian regimes are in place and where opposition movements in efforts to remove those authoritarian governments have been underway. We can also think of other types of struggles, like the struggle to get reproductive rights for women in Argentina, in particular, the right to an abortion. This is a movement that has been successful in getting legislation to the floor of the Argentine Congress, only to see the legislation go down in defeat in open voting. These are all different examples of social movements or movements that are trying to bring about change. And they can learn a lot from what happened in Chile, in particular when it comes to coordinating opposition to incumbent governments or policies or the order of things, in particular when it comes to showing what scale and magnitude of protest can be effective, in so many other things. And so, yeah, there's a lot that we can learn from. And other Latin American countries have their own struggles that certainly could be aided by the lessons that they learn in Chile. Now, we are dealing with a new topic, and we're going to begin to kind of segue into that. And this new topic is institutional contingency and regime change. And basically what we're talking about today and on Wednesday is what characteristics of dictatorships make them likely or not likely to democratize. What features of authoritarian regimes themselves make them conducive to democratization or make them prone to democratization, more or less so. And the starting point for this discussion is really identifying the different types of authoritarian regimes. Now, so far in the course, we've primarily talked about democracy, and we've talked about ways of measuring democracy, causes of democratization. We've talked about a variety of different questions that all get at the issue of regime change. But those questions and those discussions have focused on transitions from authoritarian regimes. We haven't spent any time talking about authoritarian regimes themselves and the characteristics or the features of authoritarian regimes that might make them more or less prone to dysfunctioning or breaking down or giving way to democratization. And so today we're shifting our focus and we're going to begin discussing those characteristics of authoritarian regimes and the different types of regimes and how we can differentiate them in terms of those characteristics. In turn, on Wednesday, we'll begin to discuss authoritarian institutions and regime change and the ways that different characteristics of authoritarian regimes and how specific authoritarian institutions facilitate regime change. Thirdly, we'll focus on how different external shocks like global economic crises or wars can create moments of opportunity where different types of regimes may be more or less likely to break down and give way to democratization. Now, this is a discussion about authoritarian regimes and their characteristics and how those characteristics relate to democratization. But we're also talking about timing and history and context and circumstances. And that will relate to the exogenous shocks that we'll discuss more on Wednesday. Before I continue, let me take a look at the chat. Elaine adds, the US needs to take its cue from Chile and start fighting for a new constitution because a lot of our current issues just seem to reoccur from the power of our constitution. So there are a lot of issues with our constitution. And Elaine, one problem with it is that it tends to make it possible for a narrow minority to rule. And what I mean is that things like the Electoral College, which overrepresent small rural states, mostly white small rural states, and underrepresent coastal states like California and New York. The Senate, which again overrepresents rural white states, underrepresents coastal states. These kinds of rules and characteristics of our Constitution do undermine representation because it distorts representation, and it means that, well, we have a minority that largely rules the rest of the country. And the best example of that is that it's possible to win the presidency but lose the popular vote by a substantial margin. Another example is that the Senate majority right now, the Republican Senate majority, represents 11 million fewer people than the Democratic minority in the Senate. And so these aspects of our Constitution also tend to undermine the democracy because they distort representation. And so the question then becomes, can the Constitution be amended or rewritten here in the way that it is in Chile? Well, good question. It's unlikely, though, because it's been in place for hundreds of years, and it seems to have quite a bit of staying power. One of the main issues is that the beneficiaries of the system are also the gatekeepers. They're the ones who would make any decision about whether or not to actually reform the system, and they don't seem to want to. Arturo says, could the new Supreme Court nomination that just passed shift the USA democratization? Well, Arturo, if the election outcome is disputed and the Supreme Court takes up the case and discontinues the counting of ballots and gives the election outcome to Trump, and it's later discovered that Biden actually won the election, well, that would effectively be a transition to authoritarian rule, because it would be a clear violation of criteria for free and fair and contested elections. But that's a sort of additional question that we won't get to. Let's continue with our discussion and our new topic. The starting point for today is the simple observation that there are different types of authoritarian regimes, and that different kinds of authoritarianism differ from each other as much as they differ from democracy. So we talk a lot about democracy, and we talk about different types of democracy, but we seldom talk about different types of authoritarianism. And we often treat authoritarianism as a single category. But the truth is that different authoritarian regimes can differ from each other nearly as much as they differ from democracy. And so with respect to a number of things, they can differ this much, including the groups that they draw on to staff government offices. Is it a military regime where military officers are in charge? Is it a one-party regime where party stalwarts are in charge? Is it a personalist regime where family members are in charge and so on and so forth? They draw on different segments of society for support. Is it a military that derives its support from the military or maybe right-wing parties allied with the military? Is it a one-party regime where a single party derives its support from a single constituency? Is it a personalist regime that has limited support but is able to enjoy it based upon ethnicity or maybe some other relation? Different types of authoritarian regimes have different procedures for making decisions. In a military regime, it's often a junta or the leaders of the different heads of the armed forces who together share power and make decisions jointly. In a one-party regime, there's often a politburo or a single organ that represents party leaders. Sometimes those party leaders work together to make decisions. Sometimes there's a single ruler who will hold power for a certain time before handing it off to another. Is it a personalist regime where decisions are primarily made by a single individual in a small circle of supporters? Different types of authoritarian regimes have different ways of handling the choice of leaders. In military regimes, it's often the case that the next commander in chief in line, maybe in a succession of Air Force, Army, Navy, will take power. Maybe in a one-party regime, the party puts up candidates for the election, candidates that are acceptable to the party, and voters get to choose between a few members of the party, a few party stalwarts, and whichever one wins takes power for a certain time. Maybe it's the case that in a personalist regime or a monarchy, leaders are chosen based upon succession and where they fall in some lineage within a certain family or in terms of a certain set of social relations. This also relates to the next question, number 5, where different types of authoritarian regime differ in terms of how they deal with the problem of succession. The problem of succession is the question of who will take power after me? If I'm the dictator, who fills my shoes and who takes my place? Militaries often have a difficult time dealing with this question because they are very institutionalized, and once power has been passed from each member of the junta to another, there becomes a question about who should take power next. In one-party regimes, that line of succession is more easily determined because there's usually a hierarchy within the party. In the case of a personalist regime, it's the case that succession might involve passing power from father to son, or so on and so forth. And then finally, different types of regime have different ways of responding to society and opponents. Sometimes military regimes are especially repressive. Sometimes one-party regimes create pseudo-democratic procedures to try to legitimate their rule. Now, all of these differences matter a great deal because they affect transitions. And they affect not just the propensity to democratize, but they also affect the timing, the survival of different authoritarian regimes, the terms under which they are reformed, the type of transition, and so on. And we'll talk about these different types of authoritarian regime in detail before we continue with something that's more analytical and gets us more into how these different types of authoritarian regimes affect transitions. So the first thing that I want to establish to you is that dictatorships are not created equal. It's often easy for us to fall into this trap of equivocating or treating them as relatively similar. The fact is, they're very, very different. And they're different in terms of all the criteria we outlined, but they're also different in terms of the preferences of those who are in charge within these regimes. And so we're going to discuss 5 different types of regime, and we're going to identify the characteristics of each type, look at examples, and we'll also discuss the preferences of the members of the regime or the rulers themselves. The first type is military authoritarianism. The second type is one-party authoritarianism. The third type is multi-party autocracy. The fourth one is personalist regimes. And the fifth one is ruling monarchies. Now, the first type of authoritarian regime is the military authoritarian regime. And this is a type of authoritarian regime characterized by direct or indirect rule by the military. And the military, first and foremost, has to be understood as a conservative institution, involved primarily in maintaining order, ensuring property rights, guaranteeing political stability, ensuring an orderly political environment more generally. And in addition, military regimes tend to be less personalized. That is to say that ordinarily in a military regime, there's no clear ruler or clear leader. Instead, militaries form what we call juntas, and this is an organizational form characterized by power sharing between the different commanders in chief of the armed forces. In the units of the military in the given country will determine who those commanders are. And so if, like in the case of Chile, you've got the Air Force, Army, and the Navy, well, then you've got a commander from each service branch, and the junta consists of the commander from each of those branches. Now, militaries favor unity and the survival of the military institution over all else. What this means is that military regimes are prone to collapse or are prone to not surviving very long. We'll talk about why that is and how internal splits within the military junta arise in response to threats to unity. We'll talk about that much more on Wednesday. But for now, I want you to put a pin on that. Militaries favor unity. They favor the survival of the military institution over all else. And so already we can see how there may be a scenario where democracy begins to undermine, where continued rule begins to undermine the unity of the military, and where the military may choose to step down or hand over power or call elections as a part of an effort to preserve its unity. The most common examples of military regimes come from South America. And though South American countries had periods of military rule throughout the 20th century, the most important period, no doubt, came in the 1970s and 1980s. And the run-up to this is really quite long. Beginning in the 1930s through the 1960s, there was a period of extensive economic growth that corresponded with the use of a model called import substitution industrialization. And the model basically relied on large domestic markets, heavy investment in state enterprises and state industries, high import and export tariffs, and channeling finance and credit to state enterprises. This was an extraordinarily successful model for about 30 years because it fed the growth of a large middle class, it expanded consumption, and it produced a lot of stability. But by the 1960s, the model was exhausted and economic crisis began to set in. Popular unrest became a normal feature. Eventually, it got so bad that in a lot of countries, the military intervened to restore order. And in doing so, it pursued very pro-elite economic policies in most cases, and it used severe repression. But in all cases, the military was primarily concerned with restoring order. It had an agenda of its own, but the whole context of the military interventions was unrest, crisis, in this sort of void created by the collapse of the economic policy and the discrediting of democratic governments. Now, here's a more recent example of military rule. And this example is Thailand. Now, in 2014, the military seized power in a coup in Thailand. And I remember to this day sitting at home and watching the news and watching as it was reported that the military was promising to hold elections and return power to a democratic government. They said it the day they intervened, the day they overthrew the democratically elected government. they promised to hold elections promptly. Now, today, the military remains in power, and that power is held currently by Army General Prayut Chan-o-cha, who appears to share some power with other commanders, but for all intents and purposes, appears to be a ruling president, sort of within the context of this military regime. Now, besides Thailand, only about a dozen military regimes exist worldwide today. It's not as common. Military coups are also not a feasible means of overtaking a democracy because it's such a heavy-handed, klutzy way of seizing power. Much more common is this sort of process of legal erosion that takes place under a kind of legal facade, the kind of destruction of institutions from the inside out, the stacking of courts, the compromising of the integrity of courts, and so on and so forth, the independence of courts and legislatures. The military coup in Thailand is exceptional in that regard. And the continued military rule in Thailand is exceptional because it doesn't exist in many places in the world. Now, there are some other places. There are some regimes in Africa that remain under military rule. But generally speaking, it's not very common. Yes, Karen, I didn't realize that there were different classifications of authoritarianism until I learned about them too. And I was also struck by the differences between them, and in particular, how they can be so different and yet still share and have in common that core characteristic of violating uncertainty, repeatability, or uncertainty, repeatability, irreversibility. There we go. Sorry. The second type is one-party authoritarianism. And one-party authoritarianism is more common than military rule, and it's also more durable than military rule. One-party authoritarianism is a type of authoritarian rule characterized by rule by a single party. And this type of authoritarianism emerges ultimately in the aftermath or through a revolution or through a misappropriation of power. And what that means is that it's a party that either carries out a revolution and prevails and then is able to reign victorious and design a system and consolidate power on their terms, or through the misappropriation of power, that is, by winning elections democratically and then misappropriating power once they're in power. And this is a form that is perhaps more common because of the relative ease of winning power democratically as compared to staging a revolution. Revolutions are much harder to carry out. Now, the most common type is the communist regime. Many of you are familiar with organizational rule by Communist Party organs in places like China, where the party has set up parallel organs that correspond to all the organs of the state itself, and so that they can monopolize the state. There were 20 of these communist one-party regimes in the 1970s. 3 survive today: China, Vietnam, and Laos. One-party regimes also emerged from decolonization in Africa. That was a process that also gave way to a number of fragile democracies and also one-party regimes. The main difference between military regimes and one-party authoritarianism is that under one-party authoritarianism, party cadres prefer staying in power over anything else. They're not concerned about the unity of the party. In fact, within parties that rule, there are always rival factions. And those rival factions might disagree about a lot. But one thing that they prefer is staying in power. And so disunity does not actually threaten the party's hold on power, because all members of the party have an incentive to support the party because that is their source of power. So even if they have disagreements or if they have rivalries, the party is ultimately their source of power, and they prefer staying in power. And so one-party authoritarian regimes are very different than military regimes in that regard, because the incentives are flipped. And I already mentioned that one-party regimes are much more durable than military regimes. This difference in the preferences of the party cadres as compared to military officers is part of what you'll see helps to explain the longer survival of one-party regimes. Now let's take a look at the case of Vietnam. Vietnam is a one-party regime, a one-party communist regime, where all political organizations are under Communist Party control. The top 4 positions in the Politburo are held by the party secretary general, the general minister of public security, the state president, and the prime minister. And the party secretariat, which consists of 8 Politburo members, oversees all policymaking. And so what you see this sort of intermixing or this mingling of party and state organs. That's part of that organizational parallelism that I mentioned, where the party monopolizes the state by creating organizations that mirror those of the state. Vietnam is one case. Vietnam is very similar in this regard to cases like China and Laos. But another case, and one that is closer to home for us, given our regional connection to Mexico, Central America, and Latin America, is the case of Mexico under the Institutional Revolution Party, which held power from 1929 to 2000. Now, the PRI party emerged from the Mexican Revolution and was actually instrumental in helping bring about what was ostensibly a formally democratic framework. But despite the formal democratic framework, they retained power primarily through electoral control, patronage, and corruption. And so there are sometimes questions about whether Mexico under the PRI was a democracy or an authoritarian regime. And the answer is it was clearly a one-party authoritarian regime where a single party monopolized power and kept power via electoral control, patronage, and corruption. So the PRI is an example close to home of one-party authoritarianism. And I want you to notice too, the duration, the survival of the regime. 71 years, a full 71 years. Compare that to the survival of military regimes in South America in the 1970s and 80s, where those regimes on average lasted about 7 to 15 years. At the very most, they lasted about 17 years. And so you're already noticing some important differences in the survival rates of these regimes. And I want you to be thinking as well about how their preferences regarding the relative importance of staying in power versus maintaining unity also matter. Now, the third type of autocracy is what we call a multi-party autocracy. And this is basically like a one-party regime where there are multiple parties. And that means to say that multiple parties are allowed, but electoral irregularities are quite common. And this means then that competition is real, but it's unfair. There's an unlevel playing field. There's a tilting of the playing field to give an advantage to the incumbent party and create a disadvantage for opponents of the incumbent party. And so what this means in practice is things like, well, denying media time to opposition parties, stacking electoral management bodies that are in charge of counting votes and ensuring electoral integrity with party supporters. It means creating laws that limit the access of opposition parties to public financing for elections. It means using demagoguing and all sorts of rhetoric to demonize opposition parties. In general, these kinds of irregularities are quite common. And I actually want to give you a quote that helps to capture this succinctly, and it's from Lewitsky and Way, who call this type competitive authoritarianism. It's what they call it, but they really mean they also mean a multi-party autocracy because that's what that is. But they describe it in this way. A multi-party autocracy is a regime in which formal democratic institutions are widely viewed as the principal means of obtaining and exercising political authority. Incumbents violate those rules so often and to such an extent, however, that the regime fails to meet conventional minimum standards for democracy. And so we have then a framework of competition between multiple parties, but where individual parties tend to abuse power and violate democratic rules and institutions. A multi-party autocracy is more common than a one-party regime, but it's no less authoritarian in the sense that there is that abuse of power and there is that harm done to uncertainty, irreversibility, and repeatability. Now, the fourth type of personalist regime, the fourth type of authoritarian regime is what we call a personalist regime. And here the basis is an individual and their family. A personalist regime is an authoritarian regime characterized by the concentration of power in the hands of an individual and their family. And in this situation, normally what we find is that it exists because there's been a seizure of office by the military or a party in the development of a struggle for power among rival leaders that has given way to the victory of a single individual among those rival leaders. And so whenever a military or a party seizes power, there's always a sort of power struggle that takes place among the members of the party or the military, among the leaders of the party or the military. And this power struggle is resolved only when one of the leaders prevails over the others and successfully continues to draw support from within the organization while holding down their competitors and their contenders. And in this situation, one individual wins that struggle and is able to monopolize power while kind of restraining their competitors. In this case, those supporters of that individual, it could be members of their family, it could be their inner circle, it could be their allies within certain institutions of the state or even within political parties. Those regime cadres, as we call them, they have a strong incentive to support the ruler. The reason is because that's where their benefits come from. And if they don't support the ruler, well, that's them biting the mouth that feeds them. And so after the seizure of office by the military or a party and the development of this power struggle, and then the seizure of power by this individual, those individuals who support that individual have a strong incentive to always continue to support that ruler. And so much like one-party regimes, personalist regimes contain what are essentially built-in mechanisms for their survival, because the supporters of the regime depend on the regime in the same way that the supporters of the party depend on that party's hold on power. In the same way, I have to talk to my family members as well. Yes, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you repeat your question? Okay, no problem, Edwin. So a classic example of a personalist regime is Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Saddam Hussein had limited personal legitimacy. He had limited institutionalization of his regime, and formal rules and guidelines were a poor guide to behavior. At the same time, he did have an inner circle, so to speak, and power was concentrated in his hands. It's a good example of a personalist regime. Another good example is the General Pinochet regime from Chile, which is a military regime, but a personalist military regime, in that General Pinochet came to power initially as part of a junta, but concentrated power after winning a power struggle within the regime elite in the first year after the transition to authoritarian rule. And over the course of 17 years, Pinochet concentrated power further and was able to rule more or less unilaterally, with some exceptions. There are a number of different examples of personalistic regimes that might be recognizable to you, and those include in Latin America, the Dominican Republic, in Rafael Trujillo, In Nicaragua, in the Somoza family. In Africa, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi was a personalistic dictator. Idi Amin in Uganda was also a personalistic dictator. Saddam Hussein in the Middle East and Iraq, the Al-Assad family in Syria, and then Saparmat Niyazov in Turkmenistan is one example from Asia. Now, these are all examples of personalistic regimes, and you could analyze these regimes by comparing them in interesting ways, or using them as empirical examples to evaluate. And as always, I want to encourage you to learn from these lectures in the various ways that you can. And one thing that I want to do is expose you to empirical patterns and types that may be new to you, but they could be very useful to study, and maybe in your papers or however you choose to study them. Now, the fifth type of authoritarian regime is monarchy. And monarchy is characterized by tight control of royal families over the state. Now, we distinguish between a ruling monarchy, which is an authoritarian regime, and a traditional monarchy, which is often a democratic regime with some symbolic royalty, like the UK, where they've got a queen. We're not talking about the UK and their queen. We're talking about ruling monarchies, dictatorships, where a single royal family tightly controls the state. Now, in these systems, this tight control of the state takes the form of putting members of the family in charge of the state. And members of that royal family are those individuals put in charge of the state. In addition, they also use proto-democratic procedures to legitimize the regime. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have these basically these places where women can go to speak to members of the royal family who are in charge of their particular region, directly, and they can petition them to support them and help them to get a divorce or get more money or whatever they need. Now, of course, part of this is related to the fact that the legal system in Saudi Arabia forbids women from doing much on their own. And so the proto-democratic procedures are set up in a way to deepen that set of social relations that already exists. But the whole point is that monarchy creates these procedures to legitimize the regime and legitimize the control of the family over the state. At the same time, the dynastic character of the regime provides flexibility, meaning that there's a lot of room for creativity when you have a large royal family. And the problem of succession becomes much more manageable because it's pretty easy to know who to pass power to, the next person in line or someone next in line in the family, who can easily take power and continue the project. Now, these are most common in the Middle East and North Africa, where we have what are called rentier states. These are states whose main source of income comes from rents paid by foreign oil investors, foreign companies who invest in oil production and export inside that country. Countries like Saudi Arabia get most of their income from those types of foreign investors who pay to essentially rent the land, and the production and the export of the oil. So Saudi Arabia, Oman, Brunei, Morocco, and Jordan are all examples. And monarchy in Morocco is one good example because of how powerful the king in Morocco is. Now, Morocco has been governed as an independent monarchy since 1956, when it gained independence from France. And it has been such a monarchy under a constitution that grants the king formal prerogatives. And he also has extensive informal powers too. But the king is a very powerful figure in Morocco and is not just a symbol of the monarchy, but is a symbol of authoritarianism in that country. And so we then have these 5 types of regime. And this is the starting point for the rest of our discussion, where we begin to focus on how the characteristics of these regimes affect their survival and affect their propensity to democratize. And I want you to be thinking as we move forward about, well, what are the interests or the preferences of the different members of the regimes, military versus one party versus multi-party, and so on. What procedures do they have set up for the passing power from one person to another within the regime? How do they make decisions? How do they fill government posts? In general, is staying in power most important, or is the organization supporting the regime most important? These are all questions that relate to this issue of the relative survival of the different types of regime. And before I go on and show you some data on the distribution of these different authoritarian regime types, I want to ask you, when you look at this list, what type of authoritarian regime do you think is probably most common? Arturo says monarchies. Anyone want to add anything? Does anyone disagree with that or agree with that?
I think that it would be multi-party autocracies because I think it's really useful for people to use or leaders to use elections as justifications for their legitimization of their power, so they can just rig it and have them vote for the winning party every.
Yeah, Ishan, and you might also imagine that like it might be pretty hard to create a one-party authoritarian regime. Like you've got to basically like marginalize and subdue all the other parties. You'd imagine that all else being equal, that's probably just harder to accomplish than say creating like a multi-party authoritarian regime where like a few parties can battle it out and that whoever wins gets to like basically play dictator. Giovanni says multi-party autocracy. Giovanni, do you have similar reasoning?
Yeah, I'd say that it's, I mean, sort of related to the reasons you just listed. I mean, they can mask, like saying since there's so much participation from these other parties, how can you possibly question our democratic institutions? So it's like the facade of there's so many parties that people are aptly represented.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Giovanni's point about there sort of being a facade and there kind of being like a degree of responsiveness or representativeness is really important because remember that we know that especially since the 1990s, democracies don't fail through military coups and through these like violent events. It's really more of a process of gradual erosion, right, under a legal facade. And what that means then is all else being equal, it's just harder to just like steal power and concentrate power in the hands of a single party. It's harder to engage in these very clear violations. It's easier, on the other hand, to just kind of like maybe have elections, tilt the playing field and try to hold on to power, give it up if you can't keep it, but for all intents and purposes, maintain what is essentially an authoritarian regime, right? Through this kind of fig leaf of competition, this fig leaf of participation on the part of masses, and so on. So we can see those reasons. And Martin says it could also be because they tend to outlast all others. Um, Martin, are you talking about those multi-party autocracies? Okay, yeah, yeah. So the question might be if those multi-party autocracies outlast all others and are therefore more common, um, why do they outlast all others? And we'll get to that later on Wednesday. Do we have any other perspectives here? What type do you think is probably the most common in the world today?
What was the question?
So we have these 5 types of authoritarian regime. Which type of authoritarian regime do you think is the most common in the world today when it comes to authoritarian regimes?
I think it's the ruling monarchies, just because like in like the like Thailand, you know how like they have the monarchy, and I think that's like something that's very common, and even in like Britain, they also have like the monarchy. So like I feel like that's something that's very common because like they rule like over Australia, Ireland, you know.
So Thailand, first of all, does anyone want to address that? So Juan has made some interesting points, but we need to make a small correction. Does anyone want to do it for me? Okay, so let me just make sure that we're clear. So in Thailand, it's a traditional monarchy. A traditional monarchy, remember, is different from a ruling monarchy because a ruling monarchy is an authoritarian regime. A traditional monarchy is usually a formally democratic system with some kind of symbolic role for uh, a monarchy or a king. And so Thailand is a traditional monarchy. And it is true that in Thailand, the king does have some influence. And it's even been said that the reason the military is so powerful in Thailand is because of its close link to the monarchy. But that's an informal aspect of the system. Thailand is otherwise formally supposed to be a democratic republic. It's currently a military regime. It's neither a ruling monarchy, a traditional monarchy. No, it's neither a ruling monarchy nor a democracy. It's a military regime. Ireland is also a democracy. That's another example of sort of like a traditional monarchy. Australia is a democracy as well, and I don't know enough about Australia. I think it might have a symbolic monarchy or traditional monarchy, but it's not a ruling monarchy. Um, Most of the ruling monarchies, if not all of them, are in the Middle East and North Africa, and they're relatively few and far between for reasons that relate to sort of the specific characteristics of them and often the way that they have depended on the oil reserves that exist in that part of the world. Ruling monarchies are more common than some of the types on this list, but they're not that common ultimately. Yeah, so John says it's a monarchy like Canada. Yeah, it's a traditional monarchy, so it's not a ruling monarchy. It's a formally democratic system, but it's a traditional monarchy. Other points of view or other ideas about what might be the most common type? Let's take a look at some data. So this is data for the period between 1972 and 2005. And the figure depicts the share of country years classified into each regime category within a sample of about 3,657 country years. And so you see that democracies are by far the largest proportion. But once we put that aside, what you notice is that multi-party autocracies are the largest share, followed by military dictatorships, followed by monarchies, followed by one-party regimes, and then followed by others, which might be like personalist regimes or ruling presidents. And this is interesting data because it shows us that, much like what Ishan and Giovanni thought, multi-party autocracies are the most common, perhaps because they provide that fig leaf of participation and representation that helps to legitimize the regime and that might help the regime to last longer with the support of some people in society. One-party regimes, by contrast, don't survive as long or aren't as common, I should say, excuse me. Military dictatorships are the second most common because of, inevitably, how common they were in the period of the 1960s to the 1980s, where about a third of the countries in the developing world were military regimes. In general, what this shows us is that the most common type of regime is the one that seems to have either the most potential for democratization or seems to represent the most possible participation. So military dictatorships are temporary, intend usually to restore order for the purpose of handing power over to a democratically elected successor. Multi-party autocracies, similarly, are characterized by relatively frequent elections and at least the sort of fig leaf of competition. And so I think that's important because it means then that those regimes that are the closest to democracies are also the ones that are the most common after democracy. Now, we're beginning to run out of time here, but before we go, I want to ask you just kind of an open-ended question. What thoughts do you have as we conclude this discussion about authoritarian regime types? Is there anything that is new to you or that stuck out to you or that you think is noteworthy or that you think might become consequential as we move through the rest of this unit? What is your takeaway or what is your sort of general reaction?
So learning about these regime types, Belarus's case came to my mind because I just read yesterday that there have been protests since their current ruler got reelected, and he's been ruling the country for 26 years. So his opposition, I forget her name, but she is actually encouraging the citizens to protest against him. And they gave him until yesterday, Sunday, at 11:59 p.m. to resign, or else they would have a strike today. And he didn't resign. So yeah, there have been strikes today because he's been ruling for 26 years.
Wow, that's so great, Karen. Thank you for telling us that. I didn't know about that. I actually have some great information. I have a slide on Belarus. It's an example of continued authoritarianism, and yet he's been in power for 26 years, and elections are always fraudulent, and there are always all sorts of irregularities. But I'm so inspired to hear that there's an opposition movement and that they're organizing strikes and protests because we've already seen that social pressure and that social protest can be really consequential when it comes to forcing dictators from power. And I'm excited to see too if that'll be what happens in this case. So do you think of the Belarus example as being kind of like a personalist regime?
Yeah, definitely, especially since what is his ruler's name? Oh, his name is Lukashenko. That's his last name. He jailed his opposition and he threatened his opposition. Um, the woman, I keep forgetting her name. I'm sorry. And she's exiled in Lithuania currently, but she's still organizing these strikes from being in a different country. So yeah, I think it really is like a personalist regime.
Yeah, Alexander Lukashenko is his name, and he should be careful because the exiling of that opponent, that could really come to backfire if that is viewed negatively by like other powers who might sanction Belarus or might have some consequences for what he's done. And this is the nature of that social protest um, sort of idea that we talked about, where social protests can be effective in raising awareness about the abuses of the regime, in turning international actors against the regime. So I think that we should buckle up and hope for maybe an improvement in Belarus. I think this is probably I know there have been opposition movements, but hopefully this is sort of like a new frontier, and maybe they reach a critical mass that they haven't reached before. Now that you mentioned it, I think I might actually look into this and we'll talk more about this as a class on Wednesday, see what is happening in Belarus, and we can talk about the survival of the personalist regime in Belarus. Um, Listen, everybody, we're out of time, and this has been a good discussion. I did intend on this being more informational. We'll have more interaction on Wednesday when I incorporate more questions and more analysis. But for now, we needed to discuss some of these broad characteristics that relate closely to the survival of regimes and the propensity to democratize. So thank you very much for being here. I'm going to pause the recording, stop the recording. You're free to go, and look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.